Welcome, Vernon. Good to see you, good friend. Happy
Hey.
Father's Day.
Oh, thanks, Max. It's a beautiful day. A little humid, but not too bad. How are you doing?
Doing wonderful. Recently, because we've been doing this, we've been getting a lot of feedback about it, which is great because we had our first YouTube dislike and we're very excited about it. We thought we'd have many more by now. And it's only taken us this long to get one. As opposed to like most podcasts judge it by number of likes people get, we merely judge it by number of dislikes we don't get.
I mean, it's a positively negative correlation.
It's a reference of who can tolerate. And it's
Ah,
like, I don't really enjoy it, but I don't dislike it. We're gonna hang in there.
it's like your mom's meatloaf. This isn't the best thing, but I'm hungry, so it'll do.
Yeah, it will work good enough.
But I think it's been awesome, man. We've been getting some good feedback so far. I've been getting a good amount of messages, which is kind of weird because when we talked about this and you put it out there, I was kind of stressing about it. I was freaking out a little bit, like, man, I wonder if people are going to bite off on this. It's that concept of putting yourself in the arena and how it's going to be, how it's going to be received. That's stress. Like, I don't think.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a level of exposure to it, right? So when we talk about something as candid as we're trying to have these conversations, anytime you anytime you do anything, there's a level of, hey, this is my work. I hope people, like I said, don't dislike it. Like I hope they enjoy it enough that they don't give me a thumbs down. And there's a low like hum to it. And so while you might not consciously think about the stress, that subconscious hum is something that builds over time. And so now it's not like we're super stressed about making this podcast as people listen to it, but it's a great example because certain things in life that you run into might add to that low hum. And what I like to think like a water bottle or a cup of water, I should say. And every bit of stress you put into it fills up that water bottle or that glass. Eventually, you'll have enough stress that you'll spill something over. But what happens is consciously we think of only the last straw on the camel's back. What was that stressor that pushed me over the edge? And just like our last conversation we had in the previous podcast, it's in order to understand the solution, you got to understand the problem. And the problem isn't that last bit of water, it's all the water in there. And so when we talk about stress mitigation, it's not just the most recent stressor, it's the aggregation of stressors that play a role.
Yeah, I would agree. It's people think they look at it from that acute standpoint, almost like we look at applying the physical stressor in the weight room. It's not that, that one thing that sets you over. It's the one thing that sticks out the most.
Mm-hmm.
It's all those other things. That hum is, I mean, that's a brilliant metaphor. It's that hum that's just kind of sitting in the background, and you can always kind of feel it, you can kind of hear it, but then as that volume starts to pick up, it's just that one thing that sticks it over the top, like you said. That's what sets things off. It's the acute situation, the acute problem that sends it over, but that long-term hum that's just constantly getting elevated is a brilliant. And I like the water bucket thing because I remember seeing this image one time about stress, and it was that water bucket being filled. And it was like, how do we as coaches, because I would say we are stress managers. We apply stress. We try to, bring stress down. We try to provide outlets that we can, mitigate stress, like you said. And the image I saw was a bucket that had holes poked in it. And I was like, man, that is exactly what coaches are. Like, that water is just going to keep getting filled with our athletes. But how
Mm-hmm.
do we poke holes in that bucket to hopefully make it so, that hum doesn't get too loud?
And that's where we as coaches understand the science of stress, because stress is such a general term. Oh, stress. And I think typically around the psychological stress. We need to understand that when people say stress is stress, we also need to realize that there is some neurophysiological definition of it. So when we think about it, people go, oh, the HPA axis, and that's the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis. And that, just knowing that is not enough. So the hypothalamus is in your brain. The pituitary is right next to it and it stems off of it. And you have your anterior and posterior pituitary. So the hypothalamus talks to your pituitary and it sends it releasing hormones. Your pituitary, an example of the adrenal axis. There's many other axes, by the way, the hypothalamus pituitary, like your gonads. So that's for reproductive development and whatnot, and the androgens like testosterone, but we're focusing on the adrenals in this case because this is most often talked about. And so the pituitary releases what's called ACTH, and that is sent out to your adrenals, and your adrenals is made up of both your cortex and your medulla. And this is why knowing the science is really cool. So your cortex is where your glucocorticoids are, things like cortisol. And your medulla are where your, I got that totally. Glucocorticoids are there. Yeah, ooh, swing and a miss. You have, your cortisol is from your cortex.
There we go.
And then you have your epinephrine and your norepinephrine, which is coming from the medulla. And so what happens is you have your cortisol gets released, but it takes longer because it goes from hypothalamus, pituitary, then to your adrenal cortex. But your epinephrine gets released quicker because it's directly innervated through neurons. It doesn't have to wait for the hormones to get there. So that's why we call it the neuroendocrine system. And the reason why I'm getting at this is because you have two actions. You have fast acting and long acting. The fast acting is that epinephrine. That's that fight or flight. Let's get ready to roll. And the longer acting is your cortisol. And so cortisol plays a really important role. It helps mobilize the energy. Most times than not, we're trying to mobilize energy when we think we have a stress. Perceived, I think there's a stress, or an actual one that it's physical, we're lifting. And so we can find ways to mitigate stress through reducing the ones that we perceive that aren't actually existent, such as the psychological stress. But also we can mitigate stress through nutrition, such as eat enough carbs after a workout and enough protein, because that helps reduce the need to mobilize energy. And so that is kind of the cornerstone of how we look at stress as a whole. So there's nutritional stressors, and then there's psychological stressors. And nutritional stressors are typically highly linked to physical activity because you're lifting weights, and that's burning up your fuel for your body, and so it needs to mobilize it. So we need to replenish through fuel. And then we need to mitigate excessive stress psychologically. And so tying this back together, if we have a psychological stress that begins to increase our low hum, then we might have and begin to excrete excessive amount of stress response in the hormones. And if we have excessive amounts that are occurring without a physical stressor existing, we begin to produce the stress response over and over. And it's not necessarily liberating energy that's being utilized. It's not like you're actually lifting weights. And so what happens is, if we, in theory, this is the whole idea of it, that we have excessive cortisol release, which frees energy up, but we free too much up and we start to break down tissues and we start to become catabolic and increase our likelihood of injury, which is why, like Dr. Brian Mann had a great study that showed people get hurt more during finals week. Because they have so much larger demands. And so when we talk about stress, we need to talk about it as a whole.
Yep. I think one of the big things that when it comes to the athletes that I work with, it's looking at that stress. I don't want to throw the word holistically out there all willy-nilly, but it's like you said, it's that psychological stress and how many avenues that stress can drive down. Relationship stress, job stress. I think one of the biggest misses we have is we downplay stress, especially for young athletes. Like you losing your job is equivalent, probably relatively speaking, to a 16-year-old girl or boy breaking up with their boyfriend or girlfriend, because at that time being, that is the biggest stressor that they've encountered. And maybe they haven't dealt with that situation yet. So like you said, their body's going to respond in ways that they're not used to. So it's understanding that stress, that psychological stress that you talked about, and how that parlays into athletic performance and how we should be considering that sort of stress. Like we said about Brian Mann's study, that's a huge thing, knowing when finals week is, knowing when, I even look at it like when kids are coming back from holiday break, because for the most part, maybe they were really stressed being back home on Christmas break. You don't realize that how much that's going on, but it is stressful. They're not eating well. Their nutrition is suffering, like you said. So they have all these things against them. That water bucket, like you previously mentioned, is just filling. And then we show up on Monday and we're like, hey, it's game time. It's go time. We have to get going. And it's funny because we're talking about this and how we got on this topic, but that's kind of what's going on with sports right now, because there's this back to action stuff. And it's, hey, we got to get these kids ready to go. We got to get them back in the game. But there's a lot of other things going on in the country right now that you have to, I'm not saying you have to understand, but you should be intaking them and considering them at the least.
Appreciating the entire the system as a whole. So the person and what each individual going, they got to start schools coming up for a lot of college students, right? That's around the corner. They're not even sure if their classes are going to start. There are questions about the sporting event. Do I lose my scholarship if I'm a high school athlete, going to be a senior and I can't play? What does that mean for me in my future? All these things go into it. And it's really important too that when we talk about stress, and for those of you who want to dive into it, is we understand, again, going back to that science portion, that it's not as simple as you think it is. And so because we're dealing with a neuroendocrine system, there's a lot of loops that happen called feedback loops, and the body has to deal with it and regulate it. And what can happen is someone can be stressed out and they can manifest in a lowered HRV, so higher sympathetic nervous system, or they can actually be stressed by having a higher HRV. Maybe HRV isn't the best reference because we didn't dive in. Let me use a cortisol reference instead. So because you have modulation of two different systems, parasympathetic versus sympathetic for the HRV. Just give cortisol as an example. There's a cortisol awakening response is what they take upon waking. It's 45 minutes after awakening. And they can look at how much cortisol your body releases in anticipation of the day. And so if you have a really high cortisol release in the morning, it might be because you're anticipating a lot, right? So something's going to happen. So you're getting ready for it. And they found that on day of events, like sporting events, this happens. But what can happen if we do that over and over again, it gets blunted. And so we have an under release of cortisol. And now as a coach, there's a difference between it. Excessive cortisol release in the morning could be someone who wakes up extremely wired. Someone who's under-released could be extremely lethargic. And so how we interpret stages of burnout and overtraining is a very much this non-linear aspect. It's not like, oh, if you wake up sleepy, you must, there's a lot of factors that go into it. But us trying to understand the science of it, like cortisol itself is anti-inflammatory. So one of the questions is, why is cortisol present? Well, if it's present all the time, it eventually loses its sensitization, theoretically. And you could have higher pain sensitivity. So someone gets more painful because it's less of a anti-inflammatory being present. Like cortisone is an anti-inflammatory, which is why they have cortisone. And if you take too many cortisone injections, you essentially could get down to, I believe it's Cushing's syndrome, which is we have a disruption in some of the hormone pathways, not to dive into it. But what I'm trying to get at is that when we look at the body, and we are these coaches who are trying to do a very complex thing and look at stress, if we only have one little thing like HRV, which is why I referenced at the beginning because it's commonly utilized, but we don't understand the science behind the sympathetic, the parasympathetic, the science behind stress, and we're just kind of going by the book of what someone said to do, it's basically educated guesswork to an extreme at that point. And so tying it back together from this, what's happening and, some athlete getting back to performance, that's the general stress. And then there's specific stress. And so there's two different areas. General stress has a big pathway into immunomodulation. So am I going to get sick? Am I not going to get sick kind of thing? Specific stress is tissue specific. Tendinitis, a hamstring pull. Those are tissues. And so we have to couple them together because you can only handle as much of a specific stress as you can a general stress. So if we just lump in, let's say I have 100 tokens to spend on stress, right? Your 100 tokens of general stress, and we spend 99 on your hamstring. Well, you're going to be so taxed that you're not going to be able to recuperate, and you're probably going to pull something. And so there's this weird layering of two types of stressors, and knowing too that they're getting back, it's like the perfect storm of of injury, essentially, for people. And it's being very careful as to how we stress them in the weight room to how that relates to them getting back to play.
Yeah. And I mean, I could not say that better, because when these athletes come back, you cannot look at the physical training as a standalone. It's almost like if you don't know what's going on in practice, you can't. So for me in the private setting, this is something I think that's very important, is communicating with the sport coaches to know what sort of stress and what's going on at practice, because it's very negligent of me to just assume that maybe the kid comes in and be like, oh, tough practice, but wasn't too bad. But then I find out that they just did gassers times 2. Like they absolutely smoked them. And then they come in the next day with me, and I'm just completely naive to what they did. And I'm conducting a normal training session. But like you said, that sort of stress, that specific stress on those tissues, on top of all the general stress that's going into their daily lives, it just compounds on top of it. And I watched a great presentation one time years ago, and it was the reason for ACL tears. And, when you go to college and whatnot, it's almost like we just say that, oh, valgus knee pattern, that's a number one indicator for an ACL tear. And I went, in college, I'm like, oh, that's it. That's right. It's that guy that girl has valgus knee tear or valgus knee pattern. Nope, that's 85% or whatever it was that she's going to tear her ACL. And then I saw that presentation, and I wish I remember who it was, and I'm sorry for not giving them credit, but it had all these factors, the dynamic systems, and it had a name, and I never even knew that. And I was like, oh my God. And like you said, it was like the tissue factors, previous workouts, genetics, school stress, hormonal stress, relationship stress, sleep quality, nutrition, hydration, and all this stuff. And I'm just like, oh my God. Like it almost like it makes so much sense that you're like, how did we never talk about this in college? It was just biomechanics, valgus knee pattern. That's going to put a lot of stress on that knee.
It's frustrating because it's like, oh, the simple answer: weak hamstrings and valgus. Therefore, you have an ACL tear. And it's like, well, no, not necessarily, because A doesn't take into consideration any neuromotor learning patterns. Like someone has developed a proficient motor learning pattern in that fashion. But staying on topic with stress and getting back to it, there's something that I've been thinking about lately as I've gotten back to training myself. And that's because I kind of torched myself, essentially. I haven't been in the weight room for like 3 months, and I get in there and I'm like, yeah, I'll max out my trap bar. I'll do heavy back squats. I'm feeling great. And you forget how much central stress in terms of motor drive, right? Let's think about it in terms of how many muscles are turned on at once. Without a barbell, and we're just doing like body weight movements, more times than not, it'll turn on, but turn on briefly. So you might do like a depth jump, and it's only for 0.25 seconds. You have the whole body really contract. I put a bar on my back, or like a trap bar deadlift. It's 3 seconds. 3 seconds of maximal effort contraction. Now, 0.25 seconds is how fast a depth jump might be. So you multiply that by 4, that gets you to 1 second. You multiply that by 3, that's 12. So my trap bar deadlift is 12 times longer time under tension. And you don't really think about it when doing it because it's 12 times longer with no rest. Because you could say, well, Max, you did 12 reps of depth jumps. Well, I had rest by the time I walked back up and did it again. This is 12 straight seconds of my brain doing contract everything at once situation. And we don't, I think that's where just appreciation of systemic stress. We're talking about the kind of psychological aspect earlier, but we're saying the specific in the tissue stress now, where if we have a different load on the body, that can influence in different fashions than we didn't even think about, the compressive forces. So it's not just do lighter back squats. Maybe it's don't do back squats for a little bit at all.
So I guess in a situation like that where, most weight rooms, especially in like high school or whatnot, they're jumping back into it and they're just thinking. And for those listening right now, none of this is scripted. So I'm just going to throw this at Max and let's see what he got.
Fair enough.
But they are going to load because they're going to perceive, I need to load the spine. I need to do the most bang for my buck movement. So in that situation, what would you prescribe? Because like you said, you have a very high training age. You understand what's going on with your body. You can feel things. You can sense things. But I think as coaches, we miss how unaware some athletes are with their body. And athletes are nodders. They are pleasers. If you tell them to go, for the most part, they're going to go. So how do you as a coach, how do you kind of moderate that, I guess you would say?
So that's a great, you had the key word in there is bang for your buck. And what we care about is it's not necessarily don't load it, but maybe that's all you do. Like maybe your whole workout is just a 5x5 a back squat the first day back.
Don't you dare say that. That's too foundational. That's too simple.
Right. And so, and it's like, well, maybe that's the answer. Like it's so simple in front of us. It's not overcomplicated. And I'm not saying, oh, you got to make some new exercise where you got, make a belt squat. No, like if that's what you have, it's appreciating it. But it brings up, we had a previous talk, right? The psychological stress as a coach that might influence your own decision making. So as opposed to being logical, logical is objectively looking at what you know scientifically and then your own intuition and put it together, you might see other stuff and feel some low hum that you didn't even know existed that's influencing your own decision making. And so it's the stress of what others think of you that influence your decision making.
Jesus, Max. I mean, that is such a dense thing to say, and the depth behind that sort of thought, I don't think coaches consider. And it's the amount of stress that we have on ourselves. And it's almost like, it's funny because I personally fell into this. I was previously in a very stressful situation with where I was at, and just I haven't been there. I just change of scenery. And my wife a couple weeks ago goes, "Vernon, you look so thin." And for one, I was like, I took it as a compliment.
I sure do.
I'm past the days of thinking that. But I'm just like we talked about the cortisol and that low hum that I just didn't hear. And it's crazy because you don't sense it while it's happening, but all that stress is around you. Like you said, I'm not taking care of myself nutritionally wise. I'm overtaxing workouts when I'm not prepared to do them personally, which is now affecting that battery that's being drained throughout the day on my personal self, on my athletes that I'm working with, and affecting those decisions, because to me it is stressful to coach someone. It is because they're trusting you. So to me, I take that personally. That stress sits on me, even though I perceive that I know what I'm doing and I'm making the best efforts and I'm making the best decisions. It still is stressful because that person's future, that person's livelihood is on your plate, and your decisions affect, their outcomes.
You brought up two really interesting points there, because you said it so I think quickly, but like as filled part of the sentence. And so two things you brought up that are really interesting that I want to highlight that I think we need to recognize. One is that you mentioned like stress eating, because that's a thing. But why don't we think about stress decision making? Right? We are stress eating as a psychological response to fill essentially a cortisol response. Your body thinks stuff is happening. But your brain will also pick up patterns that if this event makes it stressful, it will make decisions to find a path of least resistance. And so if we've imposed this psychological stressor of decision making upon us, we're more likely to fall into that the routine of making those decisions. So psychologically driven or mediated decision making, which is it's not psychological stress eating, but stress decision making, or almost like conformity decision making, because it's helping you relate to and justify something otherwise because someone else has done it, which is a really interesting point, because that's something that's not really, we don't really discuss that, I guess, a whole bunch. And so that right there alone means a lot to us as our community. And I'm about to do a presentation with Nick DeMarco with Elon's doing a great thing with all the, it's like a virtual internship. Way cool. Awesome. I'm really happy that he's doing that because it gives people opportunity to hear from many different voices. But one of the things I'm talking about, it's about, actually I gave it to him earlier, is why learning shouldn't suck. And it was the response. And in that we talked about how if we take the full responsibility as coaches to handle our athletes, we are doing ourselves a disservice to the athlete. If I think every decision I make is what is causal outcomes to that athlete, I only restrict myself to the lane I work in. So I don't open the door to nutrition possibly being an issue. I don't open the door to psychology or sleep being a problem or not, optimizing gains. I don't look at environmental things. So if I only think my program is the sole purpose for success or failure of an athlete, then I have not only assumed a burden of responsibility that is far too great for my 1 hour intervention, but I've also limited what could possibly be actually influencing it. So by trying to do them the best service by taking full responsibility, I have done a major disservice.
Ooh. So, I mean, that brings up, I would say, a great point then. So then I think just me personally as a coach, I want to provide as much value as possible. I want to help. Like I think of myself as a helper. Like I want to help people in any way that I can. Like that's my thing. I like to connect. I like to help people. So that's that burden that you talk about of me being the reason, of me having that, of me doing that. Do you think as strength and conditioning coaches, we almost want that? Like does it make it, do you think that gives us like a feeling of importance of having that sort of thing to hold on to? Like, hey, it's my crux type thing. Like this, I bear this sword. Like this is me. Do you think that relates with any of that?
Yeah, I can't speak for everybody. There's a great saying, there's every failure every failure is an orphan, and every success has 100 fathers, kind of situation.
Yeah.
And so when we talk about that, it's more like it's not saying that we are responsible for successes, because yes, we like to take successes, and we do get blamed for failure. So it's not saying cop out yourself for a failure. It's more like it unfortunately makes your job seem less directly important. And so it's like, look at a factory, for example. If you had only one person in your whole assembly line, there's only one person, that person would be very important, right? But for a package to get to you, say you order it from Amazon, well, the truck driver can't crash, and the guy in the factory can't lose your package, and the online system can't be mislabel you. Or something goes wrong there. And what happens is there's many steps. So who gets credit? Is it the guy who delivered the package, who brought you the package? Is it the machine that processed it? And on top of that, if one of those don't work, they can always bring someone else in to do that job. And the only thing to do is do it good enough. And so I'm not saying that, every strength coaches are not necessarily just an assembly line. That's merely an example. So please don't take that out of context. But it's more like being a team, right? Yeah. You can't win a basketball game with 4 guys on the court when it was 5. And so if the example I give is this, a waiter, you're at a restaurant, and a waiter spills a drink on you. Who do you blame? You blame the waiter, right? Waiter, you spilled the drink on me. But did you know that waiter broke up with his girlfriend the night before? Right? And so could you blame the girlfriend then? Or could you then blame the girlfriend broke up with him because she had something else in her life occur where she wanted to do a new job? So you blame a commercial because she saw a job that she wanted that inspired her to move on, that got an argument with her boyfriend where she broke up. The boyfriend didn't sleep enough and he spills a drink on you. So you can never point at any time what the issue is. But we need to appreciate they all go into it.
Yeah.
And so as a team, we need to appreciate that we are a team member, but you could never be like, oh, that's the reason they won the game, because there's no one person that scored all the points, got all the rebounds, and had all the assists.
With that, one of my favorite things is I saw this picture of a timeline once, and it had like the middle area shaded, and it said, "Be careful of judging someone's story based off of where you stepped into the scene." And that waiter thing is a great analogy of what's going on. And with going back to the strength coach thing that we talked about, I think it kind of goes with of not pigeonholing yourself as a strength coach, as a trainer. I can't tell you how many people I've talked to from the professional fitness side that have said, well, I'm just a trainer or I'm just a strength coach. Be like, sure, that is your professional title, but how much expertise do you have in nutrition? Maybe not like you have initials behind your name, but you understand it. You have a connection. You have the phone number. Down the hall is the dietitian. Like, just because you are just a strength coach, you have just a lot more, awareness of everything around that shouldn't be the only thing you're focused on. Like you mentioned, like you should be able to go and talk to the dietitian, go and talk to the sports science department, go and talk to, if you have sports therapists on staff. And it's understanding that whole circle that's around, like you said, that team, even though you're just maybe that one portion of the assembly line, you're still standing next to everyone else on the assembly line, and you still see the same things rolling down the assembly line as they're being assembled.
You made my assembly analogy way better. You do see it come through, and that's the idea. Yeah. And what's part of that is that when I taught a little bit at Iowa State, again, I was like a TA there, we had some discussions about what we do. And one of the examples I wish I had brought up, it's define strength. Okay, well, it's the most amount of force I can produce, right? Okay, cool. We'll say that. Okay, tell me what things influence your strength. Well, how big my muscles are, how much my electrical impulses from the brain can be sent to them. Yep. My sleep.
Yep. My
nutrition.
Yep.
My stress.
Yep.
Wait, if I'm a strength and conditioning coach and I need to know the nutrition. Yeah. I didn't know something about stress and sleep, because if you simply define it as the title, to optimize strength and conditioning, you need to be reflective on all these. I don't think you'd ever would meet a basketball coach who would tell you, I mean, maybe you would, I don't want to go that far, but who would tell you communication doesn't matter, or understanding the team's emotional state doesn't matter, or understanding different players, which one's the clutch guy and who isn't. That's addressing the psychology. They also care about fitness. They make you do however they can. They try to get you in shape. But it's not like the basketball coach just goes, we're going to shoot basketballs all day. I'm not going to care how you look or how you feel or how you move. We're just going to shoot basketballs. They realize basketball has an encompassing all the above. Yep. To the point where they'll make sure the Gatorade's there because they think that's the nutrition they need. That's not the coach's fault necessarily. They're not extremely versed, but they're doing the best to recognize. So we need to recognize.
Yeah, and just being aware, like it's crazy because we're all educated that if you have a formal education in this field, you have taken a nutrition class, you have taken maybe a psychology class, maybe if that's what's offered in your curriculum, but at the very least a nutrition class. If you've taken the CSCS test, there is a nutrition portion. Like there is those portions, so you are at least aware of it. So it's to me, it's just making sure. I hate keep saying the fucking word aware, but it's being aware of that and just not pushing it off to the side. But as you put in your 80% max for the day, like that's one of the biggest things I like to say, coaches, is they want to talk about the X's and O's, and I'm like, great, let's talk about the X's and O's. But they want to talk about, okay, well, if I'm this far away and I peak up and I get the 80% max for 5 reps, and I'm like, hey, man, I get it. Based off of a textbook, 80% at this week during this sort of periodization model is fantastic for this rep scheme. But that's with no other factors. That's with you not understanding where they're at in the school year, like you talked about. Maybe they had a hard practice the day before. Maybe their best friend just got cut. Maybe their uncle just died. That 80% now looks a lot different.
Absolutely. And so speaking of stress, we just had a rogue Nerf blast come out of nowhere.
Stop.
having to look alive. I love it. But no, that's actually why we brought the topic of stress kind of got brought up, because it does interconnect with everything. It is a great mediator or discusser of all. And so as we have, the youngin over here blasting people with Nerf guns, who has no stress, right? As we get adults, we start to manifest a lot of stress of how you perceive it. And so when we talk about stress, it needs to be general and specific. We need to understand tissues versus, nutrition and how it encompasses it all as a whole. And once we recognize that, we can then do our best to apply towards it.
Yeah, I agree, man. And just being open and receiving. So we've talked about that on I think both of our podcasts so far, is being able to receive that information, being open to that reception of it, to something different, to something new. Maybe it's a stress that you didn't even perceive as a stress. You're like, oh my God, you're stressing about your TikTok views? I didn't even know that was a thing, but it is to some kids. And it's just maybe asking those questions of, I didn't even know that you guys were stressing about this stuff.
Absolutely. No, that's so true. It's then there's like the level to it as well. What is stress to one versus another? My stress isn't the same as your stress. That plays a big role. So I can't just assume what is stressful for me is stressful for you, and vice versa. So, I mean, honestly, that's a perfect way to wrap this up here.
Yeah.
Any final comments you want to throw in here, Vernon?
No, man, I think this was a good one. I think this is something that, I wish I was more aware of when we talk about coaches and burnout and dealing with family stress and balancing that with work and, that sort of concept. It's crazy that this stuff, but you just kind of push it to the side. You're like, I got to get the job done. I got to get that job done. But that hum is just sitting on your back, man. I'm going to use that now every time. That just constantly goes up. And unfortunately, you don't hear that hum for the most of us until it's too late.
No, you don't hear until it breaks a window, kind of thing. So, perfect way to wrap it up. Thanks for listening, guys. I appreciate it. We'll have another one coming out here soon. Keep sending us messages, what you guys want to hear about. We listen, kind of, maybe. And as you'll hear, some of our talks are different from time to time. When we get into certain topics, we might go more sciencey. We might get a little bit off the wall. So any topic goes for us, whether it's business, whether it's marketing, whether it's can Vernon do a kickflip on a skateboard, whether it's did you ride a scooter growing up and did you have the sharper image version or not, that you were totally popping wheelies off the back. And that's a little bit of a tangent, but we know where we're going there. I appreciate you guys listening. So take care, y'all.
Peace.